when you learn how to learn, all of the graduates will tell you it opened my life. It opened my mind. A lot of those limitations are self-imposed or assumed. When you break down those limitations, it's like, wow, and then they can run with it. I didn't see it as the Institute's work to connect people to markets. We give them the tools and they find their own markets and they're good at it because it's essential to survival, right?
More than 50 years ago, a young American woman named Judy Frater traveled to India to improve her batik technique, a way of dyeing textiles with wax to create patterns. She ended up living in the Indian desert for 30 years with Rabari camel herders whose artistry and craftsmanship became her passion. Judy Frater is our guest today on Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business founded in 1920. Judy, a former assistant curator of the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., became an avid promoter of the Artisans of Kutch, where she lived in western India. Kutch embroidery is renowned for its dense motifs, vibrant colors, and variations with geometric shapes and mirrors. Judy's two exquisite books, Threads of Identity and her latest, Artisans by Design, tell the story of their remarkable journey together. But Judy isn't just a fan of traditional textiles. Over the decades, she has helped these artisans become self-supporting by founding a trust and a school, helping them turn their crafts into sustainable, marketable products. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Lisa.
I believe you're the first textile artist we've had on Harmony Talk, so welcome. It should be very interesting. Now, you grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, near New Hope, which is known, of course, as an artist colony and a haven for bohemians, which you do discuss in your second book as kind of like your muse. So you had a kind of inkling that artistry was in your blood. But what really propelled you to go to India in the early 1970s? Because it certainly changed your life.
Well, I think I can go back to my elementary school. My fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Helbig, taught us batik, and I was doing batik. And then I was experimenting with various different techniques, all except weaving, textile techniques. And then when I was freshman at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, they had already sent 1 year, I think, India Studies program. And I skipped a step there, okay? In my 10th grade, somebody came into the classroom in our world cultures class, and I can now read the mind of the teacher, world cultures, what am I going to do? Oh, I know somebody who went to India. And that person came in, and in my memory, she opened a trunk of textiles, and I said, I'm going there. So then when I saw this India Studies program, I thought, well, let me see if I can go. And I was told that the program doesn't accept freshmen, but I should apply anyway because then when I'm older, I'll have a better chance. So I applied and they accepted me. And I had only gone through 2 quarters of college at the time, so I was quite a blank slate. And we spent a quarter, the associated colleges of the Midwest, so there were 7 colleges and universities participating. So we all gathered at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, to orient for a quarter, and then went to India.
So you get to India as a student then?
Oh, yes.
And you're 19 years old, and obviously you became entranced. I mean, as I said, it changed your life. It became a lifelong passion. So what was it about that trip? What did you see there that said to you, wow, this is my life?
Well, I was at the time doing batik. I was looking for better dyes. But when I think it was the traditional aspect of textiles in India that intrigued me because, we have textile arts, but they don't usually include a tradition. We were stationed in Pune, and we had 2 periods to travel. And in the first one, I had seen in the orientation a movie about Gujarat and Rajasthan, and I saw textiles in that, and I said, I want to go there. So I convinced a couple of co-program members to go with me. And when we went to Kutch, which was on the map, it had no roads. I said, let's go there. And I went into villages and saw women, not just Rabaris. There are many communities that do embroidery. I saw the contrast between the Rabari women wearing black and looking very severe and their wild embroideries. And I said, I need to know what's going on here. And so that really hooked me in.
So what was going on? What was the tradition? How does the fabrics that they embroider, or in some cases weave, play a role in their lives? They're much more than just clothes, as I understand it.
Right. I look at them as sort of social capital. First of all, there are several levels. There are two kinds of crafts. Crafts that are made for transaction. Those are done by men, usually weaving, printing, dyeing. They're made in one community for use in another community, and they're means of livelihood. Traditionally, it would have been by barter. The women's work is used for themselves. So the only client is themselves and their family. So it's quite different, the orientation. When women, Rabari women, for example, are embroidering, they're telling stories. I later went on to do two master's degrees, actually, looking at how traditional embroideries can be an unwritten or written in a non-verbal language history of a people. So included are the motifs tell what's important in their lives, but also the style tells where people have come from. These are migratory communities, pastoralists, and so who they interacted with and how that evolved over time. So that was my first book. That was a sort of synthesis, rewriting of my second master's thesis. So yeah, it's part of culture. And as far as the social exchange, when women are married in India, they need to have a dowry. There's lots of things included in the dowry, but the women's own contribution is embroideries. And not only are they counted as wealth, but they are a sort of an indication of a woman's creativity and so value. So when women finish their dowry, at least the first part, it's more complicated than that. They display it in their own village before taking it to their in-laws, and all the women come, and it's like a jury. So when I started the design school, I didn't have to explain to women what a jury was. They already knew that. So the other women will examine and comment. One of the critical things is, did she do anything new? You know, if she just copied things that were already there, that's like not very good, right? And then they have to do the same thing in their in-laws' village when they arrive. And that's one way that ideas are transferred, creative ideas.
Well, I can see how it was a lot of learning on your part. You had to stick around for quite a while to learn what the motifs meant and what was new. I mean, how could you even determine what was new in an embroidered piece? So, living with them, did you actually live in a tent?
Oh, no, they don't live in tents. Well, I mean, while they're migrating, now they sometimes use tents, but there are several Rabari groups in Kutch and all over India. That was actually my second thesis, was looking at all of the Rabari subgroups to kind of get an idea of migration patterns over time. But in Kutch, there are three groups, and the one that I worked with, the Kutchi Rabaris, don't migrate anymore. So, and they haven't, even as early as 1970 when I first went to India. But they have homes, and I lived with Rabaris during the time that I was doing research up till 1974, and then again a bit, but not primarily after that. Yes, I lived in their homes with them for periods of time, and then I would go back to the town, Bhuj, and then come back again.
Did you learn Hindi or how did you communicate?
Gujarati. I learned a lot of it from Rabaris, because I had to. I was in situations where people didn't know English, and I made mistakes and learned like that.
You were a student, so did you actually go back to college at home and then go back to India, or you stayed there?
Oh, the first time I went in 1970, it was a college program. It was Associated Colleges of the Midwest program, and I was there for 6 months. And then I came back and dropped out of school because I thought college is irrelevant. There's much better ways to learn. And then I had to present my project. Each of us had to do a project, and I wanted mine to be an exhibition because it's visual material. So I went back to Lawrence to do the presentation, and that time, that was 1971, there was a new program of student-designed and implemented studies that was called Scholar of the University, and they were looking for pilots for that. And, friends of mine said, "Hey, look at this. Why don't you apply?" And I thought, well, I don't have anything better to do. So, yes, I applied and I got it. So from then, I had a very interesting education through my undergraduate work. I went to the University of Minnesota for 2 quarters. I went back to India and so on and so on. I was hardly ever on the Lawrence campus.
So you really did sort of integrate with the Rabari life.
Not just Rabari, I would say Kutch. Kutch is the district. There are many, many communities in Kutch. But yeah, I was doing research on Rabaris throughout my undergraduate time. But there are connections between Rabaris and other communities because, as I mentioned earlier, those crafts, textile crafts that are made for other people, well, the Rabari garments are made by weavers and dyers. So I got to see that whole network of how craft is made and used and understood.
They were a poor people, were they not? Impoverished?
I had to think a lot about that because to me, poverty means a sense of lack, right? And I think that, yes, Rabaris and other communities in Kutch and throughout India, rural communities, are cash poor, but they own their home. There's no rent to be paid, no mortgage to be paid. They have their own sources of food. So they have food and shelter, and it's cash poor, I would say, generally, because it wasn't a cash economy. Now it is now a cash economy. And so that sort of brings in a sense of, I'll put it like this. There's a second book I did. Actually, I've done 3 books. The second book is about Ajrak, hand block printing, and natural dye. And when I was talking to one of the Ajrak dyers and printers about the previous barter system, I asked him, well, how did you decide that the textiles that you made were equal in value to the grains or milk or goats that were exchanged? You know what he said? We didn't. Just let that sink in a minute. We didn't. They got what they needed. We got what we needed. And that was the important thing. So, it's a very different situation when you bring in valuing numerically what something is worth. It changes what the value is to you as a maker and user. And that brings in perhaps a sense of poverty that wasn't there before.
But they certainly do have richness in their threads, so to speak.
Oh, yeah. And in their life, people ask me after living in India for 30 years, they asked me, do you miss India? What do you miss? And at first I didn't know what to say, actually, but I think now it's the personal quality of life where everything isn't evaluated monetarily, where everything is not transactional. There's always that personal element. I miss that a lot.
It's a Suf embroidery? What makes that so special? I understand that they don't use drawings.
Neither do Rabaris. None of the embroiderers in Kutch traditionally drew patterns. The needle is their pencil. And it's very hard for us to grasp, but you don't draw before you draw, right? You go directly with the needle because that's the medium. And that's what's so fantastic. And moving way ahead, that's why I started to think of first starting a collective for women embroiderers and secondly, then a design school. When, what happens is when craft is commercialized, professional designers or merchants or both give designs to women to embroider, turning their creative tradition into labor work, which is a travesty. And they're also missing the best part. When you print the pattern and have women fill it in, it's like giving Picasso a coloring book, would you? Another branch of my research was with Suf embroidery because I wanted to see if my theory of embroidery being a language that told the history and culture of a people applied elsewhere besides Rabaris. So Suf embroidery is quite different. in Kutch because it's a counted embroidery. So it's almost like weaving. The motifs are hand woven with a needle on the warp and weft, so everything is geometric. The other embroideries are not so. They can be curvilinear and very free. So yeah, I started working with Maru Megwals and Soda Rajputs. That was on my Fulbright grant in 1990-91.
As I understand it, you can elaborate here, that one of these people you were working with said to you, "Why do you study us? Why don't you help us?" And it sounds like a light went off in your head.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking, I was madly documenting. By then, I had done my 2 master's degrees, and I was an associate curator at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. And I got the Fulbright while I was at the Textile Museum, and the museum generously said, go ahead, and I could use my research toward an exhibition that I was working on. But I was concerned about commercialization of craft for the reasons I already spoke about. And I thought, what I have to do is document the tradition before it's totally gone. And when Diaben, the Suf embroiderer, said, why don't you help us? It made me think there's another way to look at it. There is no tradition without practitioners. And I thought, I'm looking at an opposition between tradition and commercialization, but she was looking at it more continuously. And the way that practitioners can continue is if it's worthwhile to them. Okay, for the dowry system, that was one reason for one's personal ornamentation. But at the time, by then, this was in the 1990s, one traditional income was no longer enough. So women also had to work. And they were doing this commercial embroidery, working on a printed pattern with no creativity, earning equally, very minimal wage because they had no bargaining power. And so she really wanted to earn more. That's what she wanted. And I thought, well, what if we don't see those two things of earning and preserving a tradition as in opposition? What if we gave women a chance to do their own work, utilize their agency, and earn? Then we started Kala Raksha.
Which is a trust, right? It's much more than just a preserving of the traditions.
Well, it was an income generation project. The formal organization was a trust because by then a cooperative had such a bad name that nobody wanted to hear that word. So, yeah, and we started with 25 Suf embroiderers, and then I brought in Rabari embroiderers and Paco embroiderers and Jut embroiderers. So then, we had a whole range of different styles, very different styles, which enabled, we had to do the marketing, basically. And when you have variety, you have a better chance of marketing, right?
Basically, you were marketing traditional, creative artisan work.
Exactly.
How did you market it? To the world?
No, my feeling then and still is that export is not the answer. The way that traditions always evolved, and they did evolve, I think there's a tendency to think that traditions are static. They're not. They evolve slowly and subtly, meaningfully for those traditional consumers. But that is only possible when the consumer and the maker have direct contact. So if you're working for a domestic clientele, you can see how they respond. You can see what their lifestyle is like. You can predetermine what they might like, and you can get the feedback. But when you're looking at export, you totally rely on an intermediary, and therefore your creative agency is limited. So we looked at the domestic market. By the time I started Kala Raksha, I had spent a lot of time in India. This was 1993. Okay. I had some understanding of how craft is marketed, and I had some good contacts. And so I relied on a lot of help from my friends and was able to start to market Kala Raksha work.
It was considered a very new model of development, I believe, at the time. You must have met some resistance.
Resistance was not so much in the communities, but in the greater society, I think. Well, a little bit in the communities, when I said, if we're going to, say, do a show in Delhi or Bombay, we're going to bring artisans with us. And then sometimes the men of the community were like, we'll go. And I said, got to take the women because they need that interaction. And then there was a little bit of a standoff. And then they said, well, we need the money. So economics is a good lever.
So you would take the women and maybe some of the men as well and their work, you'd put on a show in another city and then you would sell the work there.
Right. Pop-ups are the main way that craft is sold. Usually, we didn't do our own solo, they're called exhibitions, solo exhibition until 1996. But earlier than that, we would be invited to, there are organizations that put on these shows and invite various groups to attend. So we would be invited. But then, you're also relying on the timing that they're going to give you, probably with not much advance notice, and whether you get invited or not. We had our first solo exhibition as Kala Raksha in 1996. Being from the West, I had more of the attitude of what's new, what's new, what's new. That's what we grow up with here in the West. And so I would make sure we had new work every collection. I would give themes and things like that. Soon, I started a museum at Kala Raksha as a resource because I know that traditions evolve, and I thought, let's involve the women in the evolution. You have to speed it up a little. You have to make more obvious to the non-initiated changes. So I would bring textiles out of the museum, put them on the viewing table, and bring in women and say, okay, pick something you like and riff on it. And they did. I tried to guide it theme-wise and so on and so on.
Well, now you are a woman yourself. So, and it sounds like you made a lot of inroads. Did you kind of have to cast a blind eye to the criticisms or to people trying to hold you back?
Not really. I think in India, there's a sort of a paradox that although women have very strictly defined roles, if a woman goes beyond that, is educated, becomes, say, a doctor or a lawyer, or a prime minister, nobody gets in her way. I don't see that in the United States so much. We have a more obvious glass ceiling. So Kala Raksha, was doing very well. I would say 70% increase in income over the years from 93 to 2000. And then 2001, there was a devastating earthquake. We had to stop for a moment and rethink. I had a computer. Computers weren't that common in India then. I had contacts and many funding agencies came in. We also had solar power at the Kala Raksha Center that we had built. So I could use that computer when there was no electricity anywhere else. So I started fundraising, and I had never done that before, and it seemed pretty easy. Yes, it's easy when you have an earthquake, not so much when you're trying to set up a school. But at the time, I was collecting funds for rehabilitation and relief. We collected enough funds that we were able to rebuild one entire village of all the villages we worked with, that we had about 1,000 women in Kala Raksha at that point. And we offered all of the women matching grants for 1 year. So whatever they embroidered, we had a pricing committee. I did lots of things like that, trying to really work on development. So as the women priced their work, this is worth 500 rupees. Okay, but we're going to match it with another 500. So they worked. What I wasn't prepared for was that they worked more and better. The better part was the most surprising thing. And, I did evaluations with women. I said, okay, your work is even improving. They said, yes, you're paying us better. And that was a big revelation to me.
You decided that you needed a school for design education, correct?
Well, yes, I had been seeing, we would bring in young designers, and I would bring them in with a lot of trepidation because I would see that there was like this headbutting, and designers would have their ideas and they wouldn't bother to see what artisans were already doing. They were just like, do my work. And the artisans would roll their eyes when the designer turned their back. And I thought, there has to be a better way. And what is it that these designers know that artisans don't know? Because I could see that they already were doing what we call following a design brief in their own traditional work. So I kept saying, we should have a design school for artisans. And somebody overheard me during all that relief work, one of the funding agencies, and told me about Ashoka fellowships, which I didn't know about, and invited me to apply. And I did. And I got the Ashoka Fellowship in 2003. I'd never started a school before. I had to really start from the beginning. And I had a lot of support through the Ashoka Fellowship. And I went back to the artisans and asked them if they wanted to learn. And they said, yes, but don't teach us embroidery because that's what, and they're all good intentions. People usually teach weavers to weave and embroiderers to embroider. And so I thought, okay, I think I'm on an okay track. And I think that's where I started working with men as well as women, with weavers, and because this was too big of an idea for just women, weavers, printers, dyers. And we had an amazing success. The artisans do already know design, and they love to learn when it's relevant to them. I think when you look at the graduates and where they've gone, it's quite incredible. They've all become very successful. And in fact, the men more than the women, because women have far more challenges. They have to take care of the home first. And there are social challenges for women moving around in society. But I think going back to the resistance I got was there. I remember hearing secondhand someone said, it's all well and good to teach artisans design, but who's going to do my work? Because that's what people think of artisans. They think they're workers. They're looking at them instrumentally. I heard someone else via say she should go back to her country, quit interfering, leave crafts alone. And, they've already been so interfered with. And how about asking artisans what they want?
So that's when I said you sort of turned a blind eye and just went ahead. How many
Yes.
how many graduates has the school produced?
Well, by the time I left, I directed the school for 15 years. By then, we had, I think, around 200 graduates. And since I've left, I think the school has actually expanded. So that's still another 5 years, right?
I mean, is it a class usually of 20, 30 people? I mean, I have no idea.
I made the men's and women's classes separate because that was the social norm. And it still is. Now, even when there has recently, after I left, been a discussion of having a co-ed class, the men's students actually said no. They would rather be, and that's fine. I get it. So in the beginning, we had Kala Raksha artisans sort of as a captive audience. So the women's class was about 15 usually. The men's class varied between 5 and 15. Now I think 12 to 15 per class. I think that it's still separated men's and women's classes. That way you can really have a lot of personal interaction.
Sure. You mentioned, of course, your Fulbright grant, the Ford Foundation grant, the Ashoka Fellowship. You have 2 master's degrees in anthropology and museum studies, and basically a long way from the 19-year-old who went to India to study batik. Would you say that all of those awards, I mean, you even won an award, the Sir Misha Black Award, which honors design educators, helped you tell the story of the Kutch and hopefully help them be more economically stable? In other words, years ago, when that person said to you, why don't you help us? Do you feel you did help them?
Oh, absolutely. I think when you look at problems and you search for solutions, I think almost always it comes down to education. Those are sustainable solutions. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to give you the tools, and those tools should be well thought out, right? Always include critical thinking, decision making and independence, I think. And then it's self-sustaining, I think when you learn how to learn, all of the graduates will tell you it opened my life. It opened my mind, where you don't see a lot of those limitations are self-imposed or assumed. When you break down those limitations, it's like, wow, and then they can run with it. And I'm not the one to say what they should make. As the Institute, as long as I was there, I didn't see it as the Institute's work to connect people to markets. We give them the tools and they find their own markets and they're good at it because it's essential to survival, right?
Well, also, it sounds like they have good products.
Yes, yes. That was my idea. If you have a good product, you can market it. And I've heard graduates say, new work sells itself.
There you go. Would you have done anything differently looking back?
I don't think so. I mean, because all of it was important. Sometimes, things were hard and there were stumbling blocks, but it's the process, it's the journey that's important, right?
Absolutely. The journey, of course, a lot of that is in your book, Artisans by Design. And like I said, both books that I've seen, and I haven't seen the middle one you mentioned about hand block, are absolutely exquisite. And now I believe you're kind of going around the country promoting this book. Is that what you're doing right now?
Yeah, and along with it, the idea of the book and the book tours are to make artisans real, make them jump off the page, see them as creative individuals, not as workers. And I know this is made by Bashir Bai, and I know this is made by Pachan Bai, and that makes it a personal connection.
And you are referring to the shawl or the scarf you have as well as the...
Right, it's a bandhani shawl and a woven poncho. And I think that's the biggest luxury, knowing who made your clothes and valuing. It's all about value. In the end, sustainability is something that I'm striving for. And in this world, we make and use and throw away too much. And how do we pare that down? I think fashion is not the answer. I think trying to fit craft into fashion is not the answer. I think looking at style as an alternative to fashion, where you don't have to change what you love every season, and buying better and buying less. And I think when we have a personal connection to craft, that can lead us toward sustainability. I asked Irfan Bai, the same one who told me that they didn't evaluate in terms of money. I said, how many jabbas, how many tops, the top that he wears, do you have? He said 7. He knew. Can you tell me how many shirts you have in your closet? Can I? I don't know. But he knew that. And that's because each one is valuable.
Right. Finally, in closing, do you have any advice for young textile artists? I think that you have given advice in this podcast, but maybe you could sum it up.
I would say, be true to yourself, find your own style. I think what I saw in the school is, the intention is that these are all traditional artisans with a shared tradition. And if they all made the same thing, they would all be competing and the market would be limited. But when you find your own niche, Bashir's work is different from Aziz's work. So everybody finds their own clientele, and the market actually expands to accommodate. So don't be afraid. Also, don't look back. I tell that to artisans all the time. If you're making what's already been made, you've got a problem. You have to have the courage to make something new, and hopefully people will like it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we could talk a whole lot more about the business of embroidery and so on and so forth, and the artisan's desires, which is a whole chapter in your book. But we've covered a lot of ground, and it was really wonderful talking to you. Thank you, Judy, for being here.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity.
To learn more about Judy's work, you can visit textileslive.com. Her latest book is available at Amazon or schifferbooks.com. This podcast has been brought to you by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Keep dreaming. Talk to you next time.